Chapter 154. Shizun. I'm off to look for Ye Wangxi. Well now, this was awkward. Everyone else, from Madame Wang to Shuo Meng and even Zhuo Chengyong, had politely stood in greeting when Nanggong Liu came in. Chuaning hadn't cared to do so, but had remained standing where he was by the window. But to Moran, Rufeng sect was no more than some worthless garbage sect he had trodden underfoot in his previous life. He knew the place was a disordered mess, beneath the surface glamour, hardly worthy of respect. Still, he hadn't meant to make things awkward for Nanggong Liu. It just never occurred to him to stand. It was quite a strange scene. Nanggong Liu, the host and elder, stood with an amicable smile, face not at all angry, but full of warmth familiarity. Moran, the guest and junior, reclined languidly in the taishi chair, with his legs crossed and a piping hot cup of tea in hand. Zhuo Chengyong hadn't paid any attention to what Moran was doing, but as he turned to look now, he couldn't help his mortification. The boy really had no manners. "And you must be the famed Mozungsche that everyone talks of these last few years?" Setting the lid back on his teacup, Moran lifted his eyes and replied, "That's me." "Such a gallant Nanggong Xianzhun." Moran cut him off with a smile. "You've already used gallant youth on my cousin, so perhaps not on me as well?" He spoke courteously, with an easy tone and a warm smile, but the words were anything but. Nor did he bother to stand. In fact, after casually saying those words, he lifted his teacup once again, scraping the celadon lid against its rim, and blew at the gently rising steam. Lowering his gaze along with those long, dense eyelashes, he returned to leisurely sipping his tea. He was young, handsome, tall, and poised. His attitude and mannerisms gave the impression that he was the true master of Rufeng sect, the one who stood at the apex of the entire cultivation realm, while Nanggong Liu was no more than a dog perched by his seat. "Mozungsche, you're quite right. This humble one simply couldn't think of a better phrase due to my own ineloquence, so that can't be right." Moran put down his teacup and looked up with a faint smile. "Nanggong Xianzhun has had no end of praise to dole out since entering this room. If you aren't a smooth talker, who out there is?" "Ah yeah, Mozungsche flatters me too much." "Who said I was flattering you?" Moran smiled, bright eyes fixed on him. "Being a smooth talker isn't always a good thing." Zhuo Chengyong finally couldn't take it anymore. Lowering his voice, he scolded, "Runner!" It was understandable for Chuaning to be hostile toward Nanggong Liu. At least there was a history between them, and Chuaning had the social status to rival him. Moran, on the other hand. Moran paid Zhuo Chengyong no mind, speaking instead to Nanggong Liu. "Nanggong Xianzhun should save the honeyed words for the other juniors. I'm a crude person, I won't understand it, and I don't want to hear it." Zhuo Chengyong was completely speechless. Although Moran knew his uncle would be displeased with his behavior, he didn't regret it in the least. The world was filled with so many vile things. Chuaning, with his fierce temper, was always sticking out his neck. Take, for example, the exorcism of Luo Xianqian, when he had beaten up landlord Chen, the paying client, for mistreating a helpless girl, heedless of any damage to his reputation. He'd done nothing wrong, yet his name was ever maligned in the mouths of others. Those people would call him cold-blooded, intractable, and unfeeling. Moran was determined to stop others from calling his Shizun ill-mannered ever again. Thus, he vowed to act even more egregiously than Chuaning did, even more over the top. It was a dumb plan, but it was the only one he could conceive of to protect his Shizun. While the other three in the room accepted Nanggong Liu's flattery and favor out of politeness and decorum, Moran did not. Nor was this determination a spur-of-the-moment decision. Since the day he learned that it had been Chuaning who carried him from that bloody battlefield on his back, crawling when he could no longer walk. Ever since he'd laid eyes on that human soul and that bowl of wontons in Mengpo Hall. Ever since he'd travelled to the depths of the underworld to bring Chewanning back, Moran had vowed to stand with Chewanning for as long as Chewanning would have him. Nangong Liu had run into 2 walls in a row. Any other sect leader would have flipped his lid and kicked them all back onto the street. But Nangong Liu did no such thing. He acted as if it never happened, cheerfully chatting with Chue Chengyong until Chue Chengyong couldn't take the embarrassment and pulled him aside to quietly apologize for not getting his nephew in line. Nangong Liu laughed it off. Yeah, it's expected for a youngster to be bold. I think it's a wonderful thing that Mo Zongshi is so forthright. After the meeting with Nangong Liu, Rufing disciples led the party to the courtyard where they would stay for the duration of the wedding. Moran sneezed the whole way there. Shu Meng turned to look at him. Maybe sect leader Nangong laid a curse on you for all that mouthing off just now. Shut it. More like you got cursed. Moran's eyes were watery. I can't handle such strong incense. That room back there. The incense was really too unpleasant. Shizun. Chewanning furrowed his brow and disdainfully passed him a handkerchief. How unsightly. Wipe your face. A teary-eyed Moran accepted the high-tongue embroidered handkerchief with a grin. Shizun is so kind to me. Thank you, Shizun. Chewanning was a little flustered. Who's kind to you? That's right. Shu Meng piped up, unwilling to be second. Who's kind to you? I'm clearly the one Shizun is kindest to. Moran taunted him. Aren't you a little too old to be making a contest of that? He turned quite serious and held up the handkerchief. See this? Shizun said he'll make me one just like it. Do you have one? Mortified, Chewanning snatched the handkerchief back with lightning speed as he snapped. Who are you? Shu Meng momentarily froze in shock, then flew into a rage. Yeah, right. As if anyone's gonna believe Shizun would make you a handkerchief. Keep dreaming. Shameless. Thus, chatting and bickering, they arrived at the lodgings Nangong Liu had arranged for them. There were 4 rooms around the courtyard, one for Chue Chengyong and Madame Wang, and one for each of the rest. Flowers danced gently between winding paths to quiet retreats, and the soothing sound of running water babbled in the background. It was a scene of singular elegance. Moran, who had been in good spirits, faltered when he saw which courtyard they would be staying in. His eyes glazed over for a moment despite himself. As he followed the rest into the courtyard, his mood grew grimmer as he took in the details of their surroundings. This was the one place in Rufeng's sect that had left a deep impression on him in his previous life. Being back here made him think about other possibilities. If Chu Wanning had not recalled him from that path at the cost of his own life, perhaps he would have walked the same road in this lifetime and become Emperor Taxianjun. Even now, he would be commanding millions of Qianlong chess pieces and burning this renowned sect to the ground. The thought sent streams of cold sweat down his back, and 1,000 thoughts rushing through his mind. Moran closed his eyes. He was no longer the youth who wore his heart on his sleeve. He could keep his emotions in check, and so it was that no one noticed the haze clouding his heart. Each retired to their own room to rest. Moran stood in front of his for a while, hands clasped behind his back, but did not go inside. One of the maids in the courtyard, a little uneasy, asked carefully, "Does Tianjin not find the room satisfactory?" "Oh, no." Coming back to himself, Moran smiled. "This courtyard just reminded me of somewhere I used to live, is all." "What a coincidence. I was worried Tianjin didn't find the accommodation to his tastes. If Tianjin has any requests, please let me know, and I will do my best to fulfill it." I'm good, thank you. Moran replied with a smile. He looked up at the 100-year-old osmanthus tree in the yard. Its trunk so thick he could barely wrap his arms around it. The dancing shade of its foliage swept across his vision like ghosts from his past. His eyelashes quivered minutely, and melancholy flooded his chest. He spun around and called out to the maid who was leaving. Wait. Yes, Tianjin? Moran hesitated. I wanted to ask about someone. He paused, and when he lifted his eyes, his gaze was torch bright. Do you know of a... Huh? Actually, never mind. Let me ask about someone else instead. Moran said. Do you know where I can find Ye Wangxi? Ye Wangxi is Elder Shu's direct disciple, the maid answered. He lives with him in the same courtyard. Tianjin can find Ye Wangxi there. Moran secretly let out a breath he'd been holding. The last time he'd seen Ye Wangxi had been at the restaurant, where Ye Wangxi had begged Nangongxi to go back with him, and Nangongxi had refused. Back then, Ye Wangxi had said, If it's my presence back home that's upsetting you, then I'll leave, and you'll never have to see me again. To be honest, Moran had been worried about Ye Wangxi. He felt that the man had suffered enough in his previous lifetime. To Moran's mind, Ye Wangxi was not unlike Zhiwanning. Both were people of morals and conviction, though one was reserved while the other was fiery. Yet neither met a good end. He regretted the past and had hoped Ye Wangxi would be better off in this lifetime. He was relieved to hear that Nangongxi hadn't been so heartless as to chase Ye Wangxi off in truth. Elder Shu's courtyard was called Farewell to 3 Lifetimes, the name supposedly taken from the phrase, one sip of Mangpo's soup bids farewell to 3 lifetimes of memories. It meant that life was fleeting, and that it was best to forget that which ought to be forgotten instead of wallowing. All would be forgotten in death by the time one got to nigh her birth anyway. How pessimistic. No wonder Ye Wangxi had turned out so repressed you couldn't beat a fart out of him. What a clever parrot. How interesting. Now recite this. 1 bowl of rice, 1 scoop of water, in a humble alley. A guard had gone ahead to announce Moran's visit and his intentions. Moran had scarcely stepped around the partition wall when he heard the languid, teasing voice of a man from within. He took a few more steps and saw the speaker standing in the sun-drenched courtyard. He looked to be in his early 30s and was dressed in a robe so humble it sported a few patches at the corners of its sleeve. Despite the chill, he wore no shoes, but stood barefoot on the cold stone pavement with a handful of sunflower seeds, teasing a snow-white parrot with blue eyes and a long tail. The parrot flapped its wings as it rocked side to side on its perch. It seemed pleased with itself as it sang loudly back, 1 bowl of rice, 1 scoop of water, in a humble alley. Not bad, not bad. You're smarter than little Li Qi, you know. He wasn't nearly this clever when he was young. Couldn't memorize this bit, no matter how hard he tried. The man fed the parrot some seeds. Here, treats from Daddy. Moran stared, speechless. Calling himself a bird's daddy. Did that make him a bird brain then? When the man turned and saw Moran beside the partition wall, he cracked a sunflower seed between his teeth and spit out the shell. Then he suddenly beamed. It was a bright smile, yet hints of something disquietant lurked beneath. Under the radiant sunlight, he projected an air of breezy nonchalance. Mozangche Moran, yes? He smiled. Pleased to meet you. Moran returned the smile. Same here. With pleasantries duly exchanged, Moran took a closer look at this man's face. He looked vaguely familiar, as if Moran had seen him before during his slaughter of Rufeng sect in the past life. Was he? Yifu, you're running around without shoes again. A familiar voice rang out, a remark of such little import but one that was thunderous to Moran's ears. Moran whipped his head around to find Ye Wangxi striding in through the moon gate, tall and slender as ever, with a gentle expression softening his features. He walked straight over, holding a pair of yellow satin shoes, which he set down at the man's feet. Yifu? Ye Wangxi's foster father. Through the thrumming of blood in his ears, Moran could hear the cries and screams from a lifetime past, the clang of sword against sword, the thunder of battle drums. Yifu! A face marred with bloodstains burst through his memories. Ye Wangxi, crying and screaming, voice splitting the heavens. When Moran had raised roofing sect, Nangong Liu had fled to save his own hide, leaving the 72 cities headless and floundering. Elder Shu, roofing sect's foremost warden, had stepped up to take the reins, marshalling the panicked masses that Moran would have otherwise wiped out in an instant, in resistance with the aid of Ye Wangxi. The man wasn't even a Nangong, yet he'd shouldered the responsibility that should have fallen on a sect leader of that surname, and used his position as elder of Wufeng sect to defend its 72 cities to the last. He wasn't even Ye Wangxi's father by blood, yet he'd moved to intercept the sharp blade filled with spiritual power aimed at Ye Wangxi's back, sacrificing his own body to protect the child he'd raised. Moran had watched this scene from atop the city walls, and his lips had twisted in his sneer. Heavens only knew how jealous he'd been in that moment. To think there was someone out there who would willingly die for another without a blood tie. His narrow-minded self had felt shock and pain. He was so jealous, he'd almost gone mad. So jealous, his eyes had gone bloodshot. He'd thought, "Great, that's just great. Look how lucky Ye Wangxi is." Had there been a single person in this vast world, other than his mother, who'd been willing to die for him, would he have ended up like this? The heavens were kind to everyone else. It was only to him that they were so grudging, so cruel. He'd wanted to destroy everyone he was jealous of. All these people huddled together for warmth. He was going to send every last one of them to hell. How was it fair that he was the only person to never experience a single day of contentment or a single spark of warmth? That the only person who had ever been kind to him had died long ago? It was the only bit of warmth he'd ever had. Why did it have to be taken from him? He hated. Looking back, Moran could only think of how stupid he'd been back then. There was someone in this world who would willingly die for him. He was the one who had missed it, who hadn't realized, and who had let that person down. Moran closed his eyes and took a moment to settle his turbulent emotions before looking up again. He knew who this man was now. This was Ye Wangxi's Shizun, as well as his Yifu, Shu Shuangling, the man who, on the second day of the slaughter of Wufeng sect, had died in battle to save Ye Wangxi. Moran turned away, a bitter ache in his heart. He couldn't bear to look at that smiling, carefree person bathed in sunlight anymore. He went over to greet Ye Wangxi instead. "Ye Gongzi." Ye Wangxi paused when he noticed Moran standing a short distance away. Then he smiled and said, "Ah, Mo Shong is here too. Long time no see. Long time no see." In this lifetime, Ye Wangxi had only met Moran a handful of times and wasn't terribly familiar with him. He continued to smile politely as he asked, "Are you here for my Yifu?" Moran silently glanced over at Shu Shuangling before shaking his head a little awkward. "No, I'm here to see you." "Well, look at that little Yechi. When was the last time someone came here looking for you?" Grinning lazily, Shu Shuangling popped another sunflower seed in his mouth. "Where did you meet Mo Zangshi anyway?" "At Peach Blossom Springs." That's nice, that's nice." Shu Shuangling said, smiling as he poured the rest of the sunflower seeds into the bird's food bowl. You young ones keep chatting. I'm going to take a walk around. Ye Wangxi tugged at him. You fool, you aren't wearing your shoes again. Oh, I forgot. Still smiling, Shizun Ling slipped the shoes on. There, better. But out of the corner of his eye, Moran saw the man stroll leisurely around the corner, bend down, take the shoes off again, and tuck them into the front of his robe before continuing on his merry way. This father-son pair, in terms of both appearance and personality, was really very strange. Shizun Ling looked very young on account of his cultivation method, not a day past 30. He seemed more like Ye Wangxi's brother than anything else. In fact, with his willful, mischievous temperament, he seemed more like a younger brother. What was, with that plaque outside, solemnly inscribed with "Farewell to 3 lifetimes" then? Was he just messing around, or what? Side by side, Ye Wangxi and Moran walked unhurriedly along a shaded path. The courtyard was full of trees that flowered and bore fruit, but it was now the middle of winter, and everything was withered. Only a few dry yellow leaves clung to the branches, quivering in the wake of the passing wind. Sorry about what happened at the restaurant last time. It was quite embarrassing. Not at all, Moran said. How have you been lately? He regretted the words as soon as they'd left his mouth. Ye Wangxi wasn't the type to say anything, even if he was miserable. Sure enough, he smiled a small smile and said, I'm all right. And you? Pretty good. The two weren't close. Moran had only sought him out because he remembered the sins of his past life, felt remorseful, and wanted to see for himself how this still living Ye Wangxi fared. But now that he was alone with him, he really didn't know what to talk about. Moran knew many of Ye Wangxi's secrets, none of which were appropriate topics of discussion. He found himself with nothing to say. The two strolled in silence for a long time. Ye Wangxi asked, How's Shizun doing? Moran was caught by surprise for a moment, then chuckled. You still remember that name? Impressive. His name is rather memorable. I suppose. Shizun is here too. You can see him later. Ye Wangxi seemed bewildered. He's here too? But I don't think the sect leader would have invited. You don't know who Shizun really is yet, do you? Moran said with a laugh. Let me tell you then. It's a long story. So it was that he recounted the chain of events that had led to Zhiwanning becoming Shizun. Ye Wangxi looked pensive for a while, then sighed. Ye Wangxi is very fortunate to have him as your master. And Rufeng sect is very fortunate to count Ye Wangxi among its disciples. Ye Wangxi, a little embarrassed, replied with another small smile. Ye Wangxi is too kind. They arrived at a small, red-painted pontoon bridge. The path here had been all dry branches and shriveled leaves, but this place was verdant, with tall stalks of bamboo that stood proud and unyielding in wind and snow. The waters of Rufeng sect had been infused with spiritual power to prevent freezing, and the foot of the bridge was awash with the sweet tinkling of running water, embraced by twin groves of lush green. When Moran turned, he saw Ye Wangxi with eyes downcast, his gaze fixed on the sparkling stream and its reflected light dancing across his dark pupils. He was the same person, but the new weariness on his face was hard to miss. Nanggongxi's marriage was indeed too cruel to Ye Wangxi. Moran suddenly found it hard to stomach. He felt as if he were looking at Zhiwanning, who gave so much of himself, yet hardly received as much as a backward glance. Ye Wangxi, why don't you come to Xisheng Peak instead? Moran asked. What? Moran shut his mouth. The words had felt overly impetuous the instant they'd passed his lips, and he well knew what Ye Wangxi's answer would be. He sighed and said, "It was just an offhand remark. Don't mind me." Ye Wangxi smiled in response. He had used to have a handsome, alluring smile, 7 parts gallantry and 3 parts elegance. Here was still the same person, with the same smile, but his cheeks were now sunken, and though the gallantry remained, the elegance had withered, leaving twin pools of sorrow. It was obvious that he had tried to hide it, but despite his best efforts, his sorrow was too deep to be concealed. "Is Mo Chong here to poach people for Xixing Peak?" Ye Wangxi quipped. "Sure am, though Ye Gongzi probably won't bite, so just take it as a joke." My Yifu is here, so I'm not leaving." "What do you plan to do then?" Pain flashed across Ye Wangxi's face, and for once he didn't have a ready answer. What did he plan to do? He didn't know either. Ye Wangxi felt like he was a moth to Nangongxi's flame. He couldn't help being drawn to that warmth, even if it led to his own ruin. But Nangongxi didn't want him. "I'll just stay here at Rufeng's sect. Keep doing the things that are my duty," Ye Wangxi said with a wan smile. "Serve the sect leader, serve Yifu, and later serve the young master." He paused, and his hands tightened into fists, the joints as pale as jade. Moran was perturbed. How could Ye Wangxi say the rest of that sentence so calmly? How could he say the next words at all? "And serve the young mistress." Ye Wangxi finally dropped his gaze, as if unable to bear it any longer. But only for an instant. Then he raised his eyes, looking at Moran in that gentle, polite way of his. He even managed to keep a smile on his face as he stood in the bitter cold of winter, resilient as the bamboo all around. The sudden gust sent the fresh fallen snow scattering in the bamboo groves. And that moment, Moran decided, no, Nangongxi was not going to marry Song Chutong.